first of all, how are you?
I'm great. It seems like we do this every 2 years.
I know. Well, it's great for you to hop on with us because I think a lot of people are curious about what's going on in Georgia, and no better person to ask than someone who's on the ground there. So, what is going on? What's the latest? I know that there's been a lot of early voting, and that seems to favor Warnock. But can you just give us the state of the race right now?
Yeah, you're exactly right. More than 1.8 million people have already cast early ballots, and that does tend to favor Senator Warnock. We're not sure, right? We haven't seen the results yet, but the reasons why we think it tends to favor Senator Warnock is because a disproportionately high number of Black voters have already voted, and that's good news for Democrats here in a state where 90% plus of Black voters tend to back Democrats. Also, more people have voted in Democratic strongholds than Republican strongholds by far, and so that's more good news for Senator Warnock. But look, no one in the Democratic camp is doing a victory lap right now. They know that anything could happen on election day. And they also know that Republicans tend to dominate in Georgia on election day voting. More voters come out, more traditionally Republican voters come out and actually vote on election day than Democrats.
Why don't you talk about, just for a moment, given your sort of experience covering not only Georgia politics, but national politics in general, Greg, why this is such a closely watched race and why this, what this will mean in terms of the balance of power in the Senate?
Yeah, well, first of all, a lot's at stake. Senate control is no longer on the line like it was 2 years ago when we last talked, but it's still very important. This is still the 51st seat if Democrats win, and it's 50th seat if Republicans win. And that means if Democrats win, they have a little bit more leeway to press for President Joe Biden's priorities and other Democratic priorities. They get an outright majority in the U.S. Senate. That means they can rip up a power sharing agreement with Republicans over who dominates committees. It's easier to approve President Biden's presidential nominees and other appointments. And of course, in Georgia, it means the difference between Senator Warnock and Herschel Walker representing Georgia. And that's a big deal in a state that 2 years ago flipped blue for the first time in decades in the presidential race, and now is looking like it could be flipping back red, depending on what happens.
Yeah, I know that there were a lot of split ticket voters in November who voted Republican for the gubernatorial race, but did not support Herschel Walker. And Rafael Warnock is really trying to zero in on those voters, isn't he?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because Georgians don't typically split their ticket. They're usually party line voters, Democrat, Republican. And we started seeing this trend in the polls way back early this summer. And even a lot of grizzled veteran pundits from both parties said, well, that won't last. Voters usually go home. They usually go back to their party. But it did last. A significant number of voters, 200,000 or so, voters who backed Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, did not vote for Herschel Walker. It's a huge number in Georgia, and that was the difference between all the Republicans other than Herschel Walker winning. And Senator Warnock actually came out in front of Herschel Walker in the first round of voting. He didn't win an outright majority like is required by Georgia law to win the election, but he came out in front, and it's because of those split ticket voters. So right now, Senator Warnock is doing everything he can to keep those split ticket voters, to keep those wavering independent swing voters, Republicans even, in his corner.
By the way, if anyone has questions for Greg, you can answer them, ask them in the questions section. We were getting a lot of weird random comments, so we turned those off, which are can be kind of distracting. Herschel Walker has been embroiled in controversy. Rafael Warnock is not totally without controversy in some of these areas, and I'll have you explain that in a moment. But, being anti-abortion and then evidence, or at least allegations that he paid for abortions. Now there's a lot of information that he actually has declared residency in the state of Texas. I guess that's where he pays taxes. He has been saddled with a lot of controversy. And I'm curious, are those things having an impact on voters?
Yeah, they are, but a limited impact. I mean, I kind of think the Republican Party in Georgia is kind of three blocks. There are the Republicans who don't believe any of these allegations. They just kind of think it's fake news. They see Herschel Walker as a redeemed figure, someone who is very public about his Christian rebirth. There's another block of voters who might believe it all, but don't care. They can't stomach voting for a Democrat under any circumstances. And to them, a Republican vote in the U.S. Senate is the paramount concern because it means Republican support for conservative policies, conservative judges, and all that. And then there's that slender block of voters we were just talking about, those split ticket voters who might usually tend to vote GOP, who are having second thoughts. Some of them didn't vote at all in the November midterm. Some of them backed the third party candidate. Some of them reluctantly voted for Herschel Walker, and some of them ended up voting for Senator Warnock. And again, just like in November, they played this pivotal role. I think they're going to play a decisive role in tomorrow's runoff.
And what is the sort of the wrap on Senator Warnock? Because he's had some controversies as well, just not quite as much national news, I guess, or it was a while ago.
Yeah, he had a March 2020 dispute with his wife, now his ex-wife, over child custody, where she claimed that he ran over her foot in an argument they had in her parking lot outside of where she lived. I reviewed hours of videotape of police body cam footage. Officers didn't find any evidence to charge Senator Warnock with any crime. Back then, he was just a candidate, and also didn't find any evidence of injury to his ex-wife's foot. But of course, she tells a different story and is on body cam video that was aired in all over ads in Georgia, not just now, but also back in 2020, basically saying that Senator Warnock is a good actor. And there's also been some controversy around his church. He's the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. His church's ties to a troubled apartment complex in downtown Atlanta and how it's treating people who can't afford to stay there.
Meanwhile, President Obama was there campaigning for Senator Warnock and kind of mocking Herschel Walker about some of the things that he has said on the stump. I can't remember. He was talking about something and President Obama said something. I talked about that, or I had that debate in 7th grade or something along those lines. And I'm curious, does that in some ways help Herschel Walker? I'm curious because I wonder if somebody from the outside coming in, disparaging someone who is a Heisman Trophy winner, et cetera, if, people feel defensive for Herschel Walker. Have you heard any people talk that way?
In general, I have, not necessarily with that Obama comment, but in general, when you're talking about allegations against Herschel Walker, his supporters basically have a rallying around the flag effect, right? Circle the bandwagon for Herschel Walker. He's under attack from Democrats, the media, et cetera. This must mean they're afraid of him, right? So we certainly saw that, especially before the November midterm. But in this case of Obama, what he was referring to Herschel Walker's. He went on a sort of a riff on a campaign trail a few weeks ago where he talked about the merits of werewolves and vampires. And it made all sorts of national news because here was a leading contender for U.S. Senate who was talking about werewolves and vampires and who could beat who in a fight. And what it did was it played directly into Senator Warnock's argument that he's unfit for office. That's been the case that Senator Warnock had to make the entire time, that he's not serious, that he's not ready for this office. And he's been using Herschel Walker's own words against him. And that's why it really became a centerpiece of Senator Warnock's campaign and former President Obama's speech, is because it sort of underscored that entire issue that he's been trying to make this entire campaign.
Is there pretty much a rural urban line in terms of support for Warnock in the cities and for Herschel Walker and less populated sections of the state?
Yeah, for the most part, rural areas tend to turn out very big for Republicans and urban areas for Democrats. But the interesting battlegrounds have been the suburbs, which used to be, you lived here.
Yeah.
There used to be this Republican stronghold. It's the suburbs, where the launching pad for Newt Gingrich and Johnny Isakson and other conservative big names. And they flipped Democratic under the Trump era. And they've stayed Democratic even now. And those are also the biggest areas of concern for Herschel Walker, not just because they're blue areas, but also because those are the areas where he trailed behind Governor Brian Kemp, the Republican, significantly in the midterm. I mean, 4, 5, 6 points behind Governor Kemp in some of the close-in suburbs, and even some of the further out rural areas in North Georgia. And those are the areas where he really needs to make up some ground if he has a chance of winning on Tuesday.
And Donald Trump has not really actively campaigned, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, for Herschel Walker after the midterms, where he was disappointed that the candidates he supported did not fare very well in the midterms. But he's doing some kind of virtual rally for Herschel Walker tonight. Tell us about that.
Yeah, actually, it was Trump didn't even campaign during the general election phase either. We were one of the only battleground states he did campaign in, and that's because senior Republicans basically convinced him that he would do more harm than good, especially in a state like Georgia, where he backed a lot of challengers who ended up losing to incumbents like Brian Kemp and the Attorney General Chris Carr and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. But at this point in the campaign, for Herschel Walker's candidacy, for his operatives, they have to think that all bets are off. They've got to do everything possible to pull out all the stops to encourage Republicans to vote. And so at this point, they've decided to bring in Donald Trump, even if it's remotely, to go energize the base.
And I know that I asked you about this, but a lot of people on social, they were asking, how can he run for office in Georgia if his primary residence is in Texas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the Constitution is kind of vague about that. They just say you have to be an inhabitant of the state where you run for U.S. Senate. And state law is also pretty vague about that. There's a number of, I think it's 15 different stipulations, and you've got to meet some of them. You don't have to meet all of them. But basically, in August of last year, when Herschel Walker announced his bid, just a few days earlier, actually, he registered to vote in Georgia. So that his campaign thought was enough to establish residency in Georgia. He's owned a home here. But as you mentioned, he also owns a home in suburban Dallas. And he actually claimed a homestead exemption there last year and this year, which signified it was his primary residence. So right now he's in a lot of hot water from Democrats saying, hey, do you live here or do you live in Georgia? Which state do you want to represent? Do you live here or in Texas, I should say?
Yeah. And Herschel Walker is one of 15 election deniers who were running for Senate this year. Sorry, I'm tired. I had a late night last night, but
I saw the pictures.
Yeah, it was really fun. But I guess the question is, is that going to help him or hurt him? And, it seems like former President Trump is going even more off the reservation with some of his rhetoric on Truth Social, talking about the Constitution, talking about, relitigating the election or having another election and reinstalling him and supporting the January 6th rioters. So is election denialism running, sort of running thin in Georgia, or is it still a powerful tool for people motivating people to get out and vote?
Yeah, I'd say it's running thin in Georgia, in part because a lot of the Republicans who stood up to Trump to varying degrees ended up winning against Trump-backed challengers. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who's on that famous phone call
right,
where Trump urged him to find enough votes to overturn the election. Well, he defeated a Trump-backed challenger, Governor Brian Kemp, who became one of Trump's biggest enemies after he refused Trump's request to call a special session to overturn the election. He defeated a Trump-backed challenger. So did the Attorney General. So did the Insurance Commissioner. That being said, Herschel Walker was among those who amplified Trump's election fraud lies, questioned how Joe Biden could have won, and he hasn't played it up in the during the campaign. But we've talked to voters at different stops around the state who said that's one of their prime reasons for supporting him, is that because he stands up for Trump. So it still is a undercurrent of this race, but it's not front and center in this race.
Yeah, I got a lot of good questions because I have very smart followers. And somebody asked, do you think, oh, look, I think I can put it on the screen. Oh, do you think this race will be contested if Womack wins? And I think they mean Warnock. And it's a close race. I guess that is a question, right? Could there be a runoff to the runoff?
Yeah, I mean, there could be all sorts of legal challenges and challenges to the outcome. We certainly saw that in 2018, where Stacey Abrams spent 10 days before she conceded, or actually she never conceded, but until she ended her campaign, and there was all sorts of legal battles. And we saw that in 2020 in Georgia, where pro-Trump forces filed dozens of legal challenges against Georgia's election results. So what elections officials are hoping for is a clean victory. They don't care who wins. They just want someone to win by 5, 6, 7 points. So it's not within this razor thin margin because that's what happened in Georgia in 2020 when 11,000 or so votes divided Trump and Biden.
Yeah, and someone asked, how has the early vote broken down by party and by geography? You talked about it was a lot of Black voters in Georgia were voting early, which, gosh, which you believe would favor Rafael Warnock.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, why do you think that? Just because he's a Democrat and traditionally Black voters have voted Democratic. But what about geography? Are we seeing early voting mostly in urban areas and the suburbs, or tell us about where you're seeing early voting take place?
Yeah, well, first, I wish Georgia, in some ways, you could register by party so we knew how many Democrats and Republicans were voting, but they don't do that in Georgia. So we're not sure how many of these voters are Democratic voters or Republican voters for sure. But we do know that in Georgia, they have a long history of African Americans voting decisively Democrats. And polls show that more than 90% of Black voters are backing Senator Warnock. So the fact that about 32% of the electorate right now, of the early voting electorate, is African American, is a very good sign for Senator Warnock. Black voters make up about 28% of the state's voting. So if you see 32% in early voting, that means they're voting at a disproportionately high rate. And also, just as the questioner asked, we're seeing a lot of voting in Metro Atlanta counties, where there's tremendous turnout in Fulton County, and DeKalb County, and Cobb County. These are the very populous Metro Atlanta counties that the Democrats need to win big. We're seeing high turnout in Republican-controlled counties too, but some of these counties where you're seeing really high turnout, they only have a couple thousand voters, even less. These are very rural counties, so it's hard to completely read into this too much.
Yeah,
we know that strategists think it's very good news for Senator Warnock.
but the polls still show an extremely tight race, right, Greg?
Yeah, the polls show a close race. Most of the polls, we've only seen a few, they're within a margin of error. And the reason we've seen only a few is because it's really hard to poll a runoff electorate. You're not sure just who's going to show up in election after Thanksgiving. A lot of people have tuned this out, even though there's been $300 bazillion. It's been.
Yeah, people are complaining about all the emails they're getting, like 12 a day. Somebody was mentioning that.
Yeah, and you can't turn on a TV without having an ad. So there's a lot of voter exhaustion too. So a lot of some folks won't even vote. A significant number won't vote at all. But you are seeing this drive to the polls right now, with candidates trying to do everything they can to get their bases out, and for Senator Warnock to get those split ticket voters back out.
And what is Warnock doing tonight to get people to come out? And someone told me the weather is expected to be bad tomorrow.
Yeah, which is probably good news for Democrats because of that. What I talked about earlier was Republicans need that huge election day turnout. And if it's crappy weather here and it's really soggy outside right now, it's cold and dreary. Well, cold for Atlanta, but it's cold and dreary. And so right now, tonight, Herschel Walker has a final campaign stop at a gun club up in suburban Cobb County, where he's had many events before. So he'll be going back there. And Senator Warnock has a big event in East Atlanta, where the party's base sort of kind of near like the most loyal Democratic supporters.
A lot of people say they can't believe that it's so close because of the campaign that Herschel Walker has run, because of the controversies, because of his, he's had difficulty articulating a real vision for the state of Georgia. He has, is a political novice. Why do you think it's so close, Greg?
Yeah, it's a great question because look, his candidacy, a history of violence against women, erratic behavior, lies, falsehoods, not talking to the media about specifics of where he stands on key policies. But he's also a football legend. And I know it sounds corny, but in a state like Georgia, where, look, I grew up here, my parents had nothing to do with football, but I grew up hearing stories about Herschel Walker's legend. I have Democratic friends whose dogs are named Herschel, whose garage codes are 3434 after his number. So he comes into this campaign with this huge built-in name ID, which is something you just can't buy. He also came in with not only the endorsement of Donald Trump, but also of Mitch McConnell. So he came in with this rare alliance between these two, disparate factions of the Republican Party. And there's so many voters in Georgia who, as we said earlier, even given any candidate's flaws, still want to vote GOP because of the conservative
No matter
policies.
what.
Yeah, and look, we see that with Democrats too, but we're
Yeah.
seeing that clearly with Republicans right now.
Hey, before you go, I also wanted to ask you, what is the status of the lawsuit in Georgia involving Donald Trump, with the Brad Raffensperger case and the whole situation where he, tried to influence the election? Can you just give us a quick update on that?
Yeah, it might be the trial of the century next year if it goes forward. But right now, we've had months of grand jury testimony behind closed doors from special grand jury in Fulton County in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Hearing from witnesses like Brad Raffensperger, like Governor Brian Kemp, like so many others, who are testifying about Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election, or in some cases defending themselves because they might be targets of criminal prosecution. In the next few weeks, we expect the grand jury to recommend to the district attorney whether she should seek charges against Donald Trump. We could have that decision, early next year. So the special grand jury will next have the decision to recommend whether or not the district attorney should seek charges. And if they recommend that she seek charges and she decides to, then there will be a criminal case involving Donald Trump and his allies in the middle of his reelection bid, his comeback bid.
And when will that recommendation, you think, do you have any idea when that'll take place, when the grand jury will make its recommendation to the DA?
Yeah, it could be within the next few weeks.
Wow.
It could be, probably not later in December, but probably early, most likely early next year. So it's going to be, you won't be able to miss it on the news. It'll be a huge story.
And what happened to Lindsey Graham being compelled to testify? I can't remember. There's so many of these cases going on.
Yeah, Mark Meadows, Lindsey Graham, just about everyone who's tried to block their legal testimony has failed, with very few exceptions. And so this judge means business, and
the DA means business too, right? I mean, she's quite something, right?
Oh, she's a powerhouse in Georgia, and someone we might be talking about in the future running for statewide office. But right now, she's got not only this case, but she has so many important cases in Fulton County going on that aren't necessarily national news, but they're huge here in Atlanta.
Yeah. So if you were a betting man, and maybe you won't even be able to answer this, Greg, but who do you think is going to win tomorrow? Look,
right now, the dynamics are tilting in Senator Warnock's favor, and it's not just all the early voting and all the issues we talked about with Herschel Walker, but it's also the fact that Democrats have already clinched the majority in the U.S. Senate, and that takes away one of Herschel Walker's key arguments, which was a vote for him is a vote for a GOP-controlled Senate. So I think that helps Senator Warnock, but no one's counting Herschel Walker out right now, just because we know that older voters tend to show up in higher numbers, and older voters tend to support the Republican candidate. And of course, that Republicans tend to do better on election day. So he'll need a huge turnout, but he could still have a path to victory here.
Well, everyone, I've been talking to Greg Bluestein. He's a political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a great reporter in my opinion. And I really appreciate your time, Greg. I know you're gonna have a busy night and a super busy day tomorrow. So thanks a lot for jumping on and talking to us. I'm really grateful, because I wanted to have someone kind of keep me up to speed about the latest. So thank you.
Well, anytime. It was an honor joining you.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Thanks, Greg. Bye.